Hello friends, thanks for checking out the video. Be sure to like and subscribe as it greatly helps out the channel and I'd really appreciate it. Enjoy! So welcome to the dark side, the role of religious spiritual struggles in the black-white mental health paradox. So first things first is, what exactly is this black-white
Yeah.
mental health paradox?
Yeah, so this is the reason we call it like a paradox, it's this really unexpected finding that sociologists and social epidemiologists have documented over the last few decades that Black Americans tend to have similar or even better mental health. In particular, they feel less psychological distress when you compare them with white Americans. And this is interesting because what makes it a paradox is you don't see this for physical health.
Mhm.
So when you're looking at mortality and you're looking at physical health outcomes, disease burden, you don't see that blacks have an advantage. Most of the time, they're at a disadvantage relative to the white Americans. But with mental health, we see this kind of paradox, and it's also kind of interesting because Black Americans tend to occupy lower socioeconomic statuses, which we
Right.
know is a risk factor for mental
Hmm.
health problems, and they tend to experience more status-based discrimination because of their skin color. So why is it if they have lower SES, worse physical health, and they have more discrimination, do they exhibit better mental health? And that's kind of this paradox that researchers have been trying to explain for the last several decades. Like this finding would seem to, kind of go against the grain, right? It would
Yeah.
go against what we would hypothesize. Yet it's persistent. We see it in sample after sample,
Hmm.
in decade after decade, before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So, it's a robust finding.
And that really is, like you said, going against the grain. I
Yeah.
like that because I remember one of the big pieces when you start looking at like race and health was Arlene Geronimus's
Yeah.
the weathering
Whether, yeah,
hypothesis,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Which is just like, yeah, you deal with these negative life factors all throughout, right? It's going to be but primarily, right, it's focusing on the physical health. So
yeah,
I do, you know, to me that does, right. It just seems so contradictory. Like, well, if you feel bad, your body's, you're literally aging faster.
yeah, yeah,
Um, how is it that you're, happy? What, kind of
yeah,
simplifying that aspect. So it's, yeah, I think a lot of people were, kind of interested in that because this is
yeah,
still a common thing. And, you mentioned the pandemic, right?
yeah,
And you'd almost think, well, the pandemic was almost like a leveling field. Like everyone's at home now.
yeah,
Lots of people laid off. Granted, lower SES were
at higher risk.
at higher
Yeah,
risk due to like, all the industries that were doing the layoffs tended to be focused in that area.
yeah,
So, but still, the fact that this paradox persists,
yeah,
which kind of you know, so how does in religion, right? Because that's kind of the crux of
yeah.
this argument is like, how does religion come into play?
Yeah, so essentially what we were trying to do in this paper is we were trying to figure out, okay, so there's this black white mental health paradox. We see it during the pandemic. What might explain this, right? So we know it's there, right? We don't need another paper that says it's there. We know it's there.
Mhm.
But what factors might explain this? So scholars have kind of posited a few different ways we can think about this. So is this a methodological issue? Is mental health just perceived differently
Uh,
by blacks versus whites? Right? When they see questions like, are you sad? Are you depressed?
mhm.
Do you feel tired? Like you can't get going? Are we just perceiving those questions differently? And not a lot of evidence has come up to support that, right? And then we've got the like, well, maybe blacks have at their disposal better coping mechanisms. So maybe it's that they have, stronger racial identities or they have more social support, or maybe it's that they have these belief systems that are really robust. And when you hear those last two, social support
Mhm.
and belief systems, religion obviously comes to mind.
Right. Yes.
And so, we've looked, a little bit at self-esteem and religious support and attendance and things like that. And they tend to do a little bit of work in explaining the paradox. But what we tried to do in this paper is, okay, like maybe it's just that rather than experiencing more of the good in religion, maybe it's that black people experience less of the bad. So as you
Mm.
mentioned kind of at the outset, there's this whole like dark, like what they call the dark side of religion. Like what might be some negative consequences that fall from, being involved in religion or in a religious community or having religious belief, right? Because
Right.
it's not all positive, and we see that. in society. And so what we were trying to do in this paper is like, okay, we're going to look at one aspect of like the negative side of religion. And maybe if blacks and whites have a differential propensity to experience these types of beliefs, maybe that also is going to explain that gap,
I see.
right? So we looked in this paper at religious and spiritual struggles,
Mm.
which are essentially like tensions or conflict or doubts about one's faith, right? Like
Hmm.
maybe being angry at God or being uncertain about the teachings of your faith, or, just kind of not being sure, right?
Yeah. And is this I think I'll kind of get into it in the article from what I remember, but
Yeah.
especially when major controversial topics go through. So I thought
Yeah.
I know Roe v. Wade comes to mind,
Right.
but I know the article has it's forth. I think this
Forthcoming.
one's
Yeah.
forthcoming. Yes,
Yeah.
so that was not there. But how does something like that? Well, that do you think give a huge rise to that tension you were?
Yeah, possibly. So it's like, if you were to, believe in religious doctrine that says, that abortion should never happen, that it's a grave sin, right? And how do you then reconcile that
Mhm.
with, you know, what we know goes on, and who's more likely to get an abortion? It also tends to be lower status people. And so you're kind of thinking like, yeah, that might be one thing that people's, how they live in society conflicts with what their religion's telling them to do. So that
Mm.
could be a form of struggle,
Okay.
right? Even for people who aren't contemplating an abortion or who have not had an abortion, it's kind of thinking like, well, what if I was in this situation? And so forth. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's one. Other issues, right? Like same-sex marriage,
Hmm. Hmm.
premarital cohabitation, um, you know, support for various charities. Should America be a Christian nation?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so forth. And should we, support politicians with this view? I mean, you could take any issue and essentially make it a politicized religious issue.
Mhm.
Um,
Which I mean, yeah, you're kind of saying is like it's it, especially in recent years, it has that has seemed to have picked up steam, right? The
sure.
whole bringing back prayer into
Yeah.
schools and everything, right? It's
Right.
um so it's even though I know we're not going down that path
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
here, but I do think that kind of raises the question of like because when you hear that,
Yeah.
people immediately think they're like, well, what happened to separation of church and state,
Right.
right? But then it's also if you are a religious, follower,
Yeah.
especially Christianity
Yeah.
here in the U.S.,
Yeah.
it's right. It's like how might that give tension? Because what if, right, you're Christian, but you're in a same-sex marriage, or
Sure.
right, all these
Yeah.
things, but all of a sudden now it's being brought to the
Yeah.
forefront. So
Yeah.
where you used to go by and like no one really
Yeah.
cared or necessarily said anything, all of a sudden now it is the
Yeah,
talking
and it's
point.
something that's, you would talk about with your friends over drinks, or,
Right,
it
right.
would come up in the workplace. I mean, Roe v. Wade being overturned was this major thing that, nobody thought would ever happen. When it was put in place like 50 years ago. And then it happened and it just sparked all this conversation, and that's only like one form of religious or spiritual struggle,
Yes,
right? Like
yes.
that's like so that's certainly part of it. But then there's also like, okay, well the pandemic happened. Like, should I blame God for that?
Right.
Or, my husband or wife or friend died. Should I blame God for that?
Mhm.
Is God punishing me? Do I feel distant from God? Um, do I feel
Yeah.
like members of my church or my faith community are judging me? Because I don't go to church every Sunday, or, I live with my partner and we're not married, or whatever the case might be, right?
Yeah.
Like there's just this broad array of like tension or conflict about spiritual matters is essentially how to think about religious and spiritual struggles, right? That
Mhm.
there's this almost like disconnect between what you're told to believe and then what you're actually experiencing in your own religious journey.